Hey guys, tonight we're sinking into something a little darker, a little stranger, and honestly, a little fun in that your history teacher would never explain it this way kind of vibe. You settle into your pillow as I guide you through the first trembling footsteps of the Bourbon bloodline, yes. That family whose destiny reads like a slow-motion car crash in velvet robes. You feel the cool air of your room, maybe the soft hum of your fan, and imagine yourself walking through a dim medieval hall where every portrait seems to be staring back at you with judgment. If you had to live in those drafty stone corridors, let's be honest, you probably wouldn't survive a week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the edge of a forested ridge in southern France. The air wet with dew and the crunch of gravel under your feet sounding strangely loud. This is where the Bourbon story begins, quiet, unassuming, like most curses do. You hear distant bells from a monastery. The kind that make you feel like you should be whispering even if no one is around. The earliest Bourbons were just local lords with more stubbornness than land. But something in their history always felt tilted. That odd sensation you get when you're reading a family tree and half the branches mysteriously snap off earlier than they should. As you follow a mossy path, you imagine the first Bourbon names echoing out of time, Robert of Clermont. The son of France who married into the Bourbon lands. People love to say his marriage raised the family. But you sense something else. The union felt too convenient, too tidy, like fate was already tugging threads behind a curtain. And even then, whispers floated around court that the bloodline carried unusual fortune, bright, brief, and always tinged with tragedy. Historians still debate whether these early stories were simply exaggerated by nostalgic chroniclers or whether there really was a strange pattern in the family's early mishaps. You step through the ruins of an old stronghold, the stones cold under your fingers. Imagine the young Bourbon lords pacing the same floors centuries earlier, plotting, arguing, probably spilling wine on priceless tapestries and insisting it was artistic. They were ambitious, not the slow-burning kind of ambition, but the type that latches on like a fever. One moment they were minor nobility. The next, they were marrying into more powerful families, slicing their way upward through alliances that were half political strategy and half chaotic impulse. If the Bourbons had a motto, it should have been something like, go big, or catastrophically combust. But even here at the start, something in the air feels off balance. You hear the soft shuffle of leaves, like memories brushing past you. The early Bourbon generations dealt with disputes that seemed almost cursed in their timing. Inheritances contested the moment a lord fell ill. Heirs fighting over land they didn't yet own. Feuds blooming like weeds between cousins. One chronicle even described a string of accidents, horses stumbling at the worst moments. Halls collapsing at suspiciously convenient times. A peculiar illness that always struck just one specific branch of the family. Some said it was divine punishment. Others blamed poor sanitation, which, honestly, is extremely plausible. Medieval people considered bathing optional, and their idea of medicine often involved boiling herbs that smelled like expired pesto. But even with those explanations, something about the pattern made people uneasy. You move deeper into the imagined scene, and the air thickens with the scent of burning wood from some long-ago hearth. You can almost hear the crackling fires where early Bourbons would gather, arguing through the night about lineage, honor, and whose turn it was to repair the outer wall. Every family has drama, but this one seemed unusually drawn to the kind that ends with someone storming out of the room and slamming a very expensive door. And yet, despite all this chaos, the Bourbons kept rising. Their influence grew with every marriage and every conveniently timed death, too conveniently timed. Some said, one tale insists that a Bourbon lord lost 3 rivals in the span of a single season, one to illness, one to a horse accident, and one to an unfortunate trip down the stairs. People in the village started avoiding the family. Because, proximity to misfortune isn't exactly something you want on your resume. Historians still debate whether this early pattern of misfortune was coincidence or if chroniclers retroactively painted the family with a darker brush once the later disasters unfolded. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, like most history and like most family drama. But when you look at the line from its beginnings, you can't ignore how often things tipped toward calamity just as the Bourbons gained something valuable. For every promotion, there was a feud. For every inheritance, a suspicious tragedy. For every step upward, something small and sharp broke off beneath them. You can almost picture one of the early Bourbon leaders looking into a polished metal mirror. Glass wasn't common yet. And seeing not their reflection, but the shadow of what the family would eventually become. Maybe that's dramatic, but it's hard not to feel that energy in these origins. You look out a cracked window in your imagination and see villages that would eventually become French strongholds. The people living in those villages didn't know that this rising family would one day be both the glory and downfall of France. To them, the Bourbons were just another ambitious clan, loud, proud, and occasionally prone to setting things on fire by accident. As the wind whistles through the stones around you, you feel that this beginning is less of a starting point and more of a warning. A quiet voice from the past, murmuring that no power comes without a price. And the Bourbons, whether they knew it or not, had just signed the down payment on centuries of triumph, heartbreak, and fate spiraling out of their control. And as you take one last slow breath in this dark corridor of origins, you feel the weight of the family name settle around you like a cloak, grand, heavy, and already fraying at the edges as their story rolls forward, waiting for its next twist. You drift forward through that dim corridor of Bourbon beginnings, feeling the stone chill against your skin as the air shifts, like history is exhaling slowly, nudging you into the next chapter. You don't step so much as glide, the way you do in dreams when your feet don't bother with the inconvenience of gravity. Ahead of you, the shadows stretch longer, deeper. They start to pull you toward a place where ambition sharpens its teeth. Because for the Bourbons, rise was never quiet. It was a scramble, a shove, a series of elbows thrown so confidently you'd think the family trained in political jiu-jitsu. You step out into the mental image of a medieval courtyard, muddy and loud, the kind of place where men in armor gossip more than teenage group chats. Here, the early Bourbons are still just powerful nobles, counts. Dukes, hovering close enough to the French throne to smell opportunity. Close enough to want more. And you can feel it immediately. That tension humming in the air like a barely tuned string. These weren't patient people. They wanted influence like toddlers want snacks, aggressively. Constantly. And with a willingness to scream if someone took it away. You walk past a pair of imagined soldiers bickering about land disputes while chickens strut like they own the place. And you realize that the Bourbon climb to power wasn't elegant or inevitable. It was messy, improvised, and full of choices that swung wildly between genius and, you cannot be serious. Every time the Bourbons gained a foothold, someone in the family managed to stir up conflict, because nothing says, we deserve authority, like fighting your relatives over vineyards. And this is where you start to sense the early glimmers of that so-called curse. Not supernatural lightning bolts or glowing runes, just human nature. The kind that makes people sabotage themselves even while they're reaching for greatness. Some chroniclers wrote that at least 3 Bourbon cousins fought over a single inheritance so viciously that the king himself had to intervene. Others said the family divided over questions of honor that were basically disagreements about who insulted whose horse. Historians still debate whether these accounts were exaggerated or if the Bourbons truly had a talent for creating drama out of thin air. You move through a hall where flickering torches cast amber light across carved stone faces. They look stern, judgmental. Like the ancestors are already disappointed in how their descendants will turn out. One of those faces belongs to Louis I, Duke of Bourbon. A capable leader whose actions pushed the family upward. But even he battled rival nobles so frequently that some records read like a medieval season of reality TV. There's a moment where you imagine him whispering to you. This was all supposed to be easier, and honestly, you believe him. You feel a shift in the floor beneath you. Like stepping from one century into the next. Suddenly, the palace corridors grow more ornate, gilded railings. Patterned tapestries. The kind of luxury that makes you instinctively walk slower so you don't accidentally knock over something that costs more than your entire life. The Bourbons are rising in power now. Climbing toward the royal orbit. But with every ascent comes a new conflict. A new enemy. A new cousin who claims the estate papers were forged. It's exhausting, and you're not even the one running a kingdom. As you lean against a marble column, you feel a distant rumble, horse hooves. The clatter of armor. The anxious whispers of diplomats. The Bourbons are entangling themselves in France's deeper political web. And it's a web they'll both control and be strangled by. You picture the family gathered around a heavy wooden table. Each member plotting alliances, marriages, and strategies with the enthusiasm of chess players who refuse to acknowledge they are terrible at chess. Some stories say a Bourbon lord once sealed an alliance only to break it within a week because he claimed he had a feeling. What kind of feeling? No one clarifies. Maybe it was intuition. Maybe it was indigestion from medieval cheese. But that decision spiraled into a feud that lasted decades. This is the sort of moment where you think, maybe the curse didn't haunt them. Maybe they haunted themselves. You wander closer to a grand doorway. The kind that practically vibrates with self-importance. Behind it, you hear voices, raised, biting, tense. The Bourbons are arguing again. The details blur, but the emotional shape is familiar. Someone wants more land. Someone else wants more titles. A third insists they deserve compensation because their cousin stood too close to their hunting dog. And in the middle of all this chaos, the family inch their way upward, outmaneuvering rivals almost by accident. But even as they succeed, you notice patterns repeating, eldest sons conveniently losing favor, alliances breaking at the most disastrous moments, neighboring lords exploiting Bourbon infighting to seize territory. One historian once wrote that early Bourbon politics showed a rhythm of gain followed reliably by a stumble. Others disagree, insisting the setbacks were just typical medieval turbulence. Either way, the timing always feels uncanny. Like the universe kept nudging the family into trouble the moment they reached too high. You hear banners fluttering above you, blue, gold, proud, and yet, beneath that pride is an undercurrent of fragility. The Bourbons weren't united by vision, they were united by ambition. That's a shaky foundation, the kind that cracks if you breathe too hard. And you're standing on it now, feeling it tremble underfoot. The air grows warmer as you move into a chamber lined with maps, territories divided, conquered, disputed, color-coded like the world's most aggressive board game. A Bourbon lord stands beside the map in your imagination, jabbing at borders and insisting the family deserves more. You sense his frustration, the kind that simmers into dangerous decisions. No one in this room trusts each other fully. No one fully understands the weight of the path they're carving. Everyone is convinced they were meant for greatness. The family's desperation expands like a pressure wave, and you feel it pressing into your ribs. Their ambition is becoming less about opportunity and more about survival. They were climbing, and the higher they climbed, the more the ground threatened to fall away. And as you step toward a balcony overlooking an imagined medieval city, the sun setting in a haze of gold and smoke, you understand the heart of this moment. The Bourbons had risen enough to taste real power, but not enough to keep it without tearing pieces off their own lineage. The scramble for influence was creating cracks, hairline fractures now, but deepening with every new rivalry. A cool breeze brushes your cheek, and for a moment you feel the quiet after the storm, except the storm hasn't happened yet. You're simply standing at the edge of it, watching the Bourbon curse stretch its fingers, tracing the edges of a family that doesn't yet realize how fragile their ascent truly is. And when you turn away from the balcony, you feel history tightening around you, nudging you onward, toward the next step in the unraveling. You drift from that balcony into a deeper hush, the kind that folds around you like a heavy velvet curtain. The colors fade, the torches dim, and suddenly you're walking through the early Bourbon court, no longer a scrappy realm of bickering nobles, but the glittering, echo-filled world where France's crown begins to loom overhead like a prize too tempting to resist. And as you glide over polished stone floors, you sense that the air has changed. It's tighter now, heavier, as if everyone in this palace is holding their breath, waiting for someone to make a decision that will either elevate the family forever or ruin them before lunch. You hear the rustle of robes before you see the figures, advisors, stewards, distant cousins with opinions no one asked for. The Bourbons have stepped into the bigger arena, and suddenly every choice matters. The crown is no longer just a distant symbol, flickering on the horizon. It's right here. Its glow bright enough to warm the room and burn your fingertips at the same time. You can almost feel the weight of the royal seal pressing against your palm. Cool and authoritative, whispering promises. Promises that will unravel faster than anyone anticipates. You find yourself in a grand hall with banners hanging in solemn rows, each one bearing a fleur-de-lis that feels more like an ominous warning than a symbol of pride. The Bourbons are aligning themselves with the Capetian kings, working their way into positions of influence. Diplomatic marriages, military support, clever maneuvering. It all starts to look like careful planning. Except nothing about the Bourbons is truly careful. They had strategy, sure, but they also had a habit of leaping before looking, or leaping while looking directly at someone they intended to shove out of the way. Even now, as you pass through sunlight filtering from stained glass windows, you feel the tension humming beneath the polished surface. The Bourbon lords aren't just serving the French monarchy, they're studying it, poking at its weaknesses, dreaming quietly of stepping closer. You catch glimpses of conversations, whispers about succession, land grants, about which royal cousin currently hates which advisor. Court life at this point is one part chess, one part circus, and one part, don't eat the cheese unless you know who made it. Because poison was a hobby for some people, and you do not want to meet those people. A young Bourbon noble strides past you in the haze of imagination, his shoes clicking sharply as he mutters about the king's latest decree. He looks frustrated, eager, hopeful, terrified, all at once. The family has become too big, too influential to remain modest, but not stable enough to wield power without shaking. And here, in this gilded hall, you get the sense that their story is accelerating, like they've been climbing a staircase and suddenly realize it's an escalator moving way too fast. The Bourbon entanglement with the crown deepens when political storms start rolling through France. Disputes over provinces, squabbles with other noble families, and a royal court that sometimes feels like a competition for who can make the most disastrous decision. In the middle of all this, the Bourbons keep nudging themselves closer to the center. Not aggressively, not always aggressively, but persistently. Every alliance strengthened their position. Every misstep by their rivals opened another door. And yet, even as they rise, you hear the quiet rattle of uncertainty. The crown they're chasing isn't a reward, it's a burden wrapped in gold foil. France is not the serene, orderly kingdom people like to imagine. It's unpredictable, stretched thin by conflict, and simmering with public discontent. One historian once said that early Bourbon influence grew at a moment when the monarchy needed stability and received ambition instead. Others argue that the Bourbons were merely products of their time, reactive, opportunistic, not cursed so much as unlucky. But as you look around at these imagined courtiers, you feel the strain. Something is undeniably fragile. You pause near a carved doorway where royal advisors are debating strategy. Their arguments drift through the hall like smoke, tense, heated, occasionally absurd. Someone complains about a tax proposal. Someone else insists that the king's brother should never be allowed near a battlefield again after the incident, which no one elaborates on. And in the middle of these debates, a Bourbon voice pipes up, offering a solution, a bold one, too bold. You watch as the room goes quiet, not because the idea is bad, but because it is good and dangerous. The Bourbons are starting to be taken seriously. And nothing attracts enemies faster. You continue walking, imagining the footsteps of those who lived here centuries before you. The marble beneath your feet has seen arguments, celebrations, scandals, and more dramatic fainting episodes than you would believe. Fainting was basically a sport in royal courts. If they'd had medals for it, half the nobility would have been Olympic champions. And somewhere in all this drama, the Bourbons learn how to navigate the crown's labyrinth, how to speak with authority, how to wield influence, how to smile while planning 5 moves ahead. But the closer they get to the throne, the more dangerous the air becomes. You feel it like a tightening around your ribs. The crown is beginning to cast a longer shadow, one that stretches over their ambition and twists it into something hungrier, something desperate. You sense that the family is drifting toward choices that will ripple outward in ways they can't foresee. There's a moment where you pause, listening to the echoes bouncing off high ceilings. And it almost feels like the palace itself is trying to warn them. You come upon an open balcony overlooking the city, Paris. Sprawling and complicated, already humming with the early energy that will one day feed its revolutions. Smoke rises from chimneys, market voices drift upward, and somewhere below, a child laughs. That laughter feels out of place here. Among all this tension, maybe that's why it stands out. You look at the city and understand, the Bourbons are shaping France. Yes, but France is shaping them too. Pressing its expectations, its instability, its restlessness into every decision they make. And as you turn away from the view, the corridor behind you stretches long and dark. You sense the Bourbon path pulling you onward, toward the next turn in their story, toward the era where the family begins to shine brilliantly and crack dangerously. Because once they step deeper into the royal circle, their fate becomes something they can no longer control. The crown they chase is starting to chase them back. And in this softening light, you feel the tension rising like a tide, whispering that the Bourbon curse is no longer a rumor at the edges of their history. It's beginning to tap on the door. You step deeper into the palace corridors, and the air shifts again, this time sharper. Like a blade sliding halfway out of its sheath, there's a faint metallic scent, the kind that makes your skin prickle even though nothing touches you. Because now you're moving into a world obsessed with honor, reputation, and the kind of personal pride that could turn a mildly insulting comment into a full-scale duel before breakfast. And for the Bourbons, that obsession wasn't just a personality quirk, it was practically a lifestyle. As you drift into a courtyard washed in pale moonlight, you see figures pacing in tense circles, hands hovering near sword hilts, faces tight with fury. If a modern therapist had time traveled into this era, the poor thing would have quit within a week. Here, a raised eyebrow could be interpreted as a declaration of war. An offhand remark about someone's horse? That might get you stabbed. Even the slightest hint that a noble didn't bow deeply enough was treated like the medieval equivalent of unfollowing someone on social media. The Bourbon family, already fiery from generations of political ambition, dove into this culture like it was a sport they were determined to master. You feel the crunch of gravel beneath your feet as you walk across the courtyard. The torches flickering in long, uncertain lines. A tense circle of nobles surrounds 2 men, both stiff with pride, both pretending this duel isn't a terrible idea. One of them carries the unmistakable Bourbon sharpness, eyes that flash as if every insult has been simmering in his mind for weeks. You watch him pace, adjusting the fall of his cloak with the dramatic flair of someone who wants witnesses. And trust me, duels always had witnesses, even if it was supposed to be secret. Someone always, accidentally, brought a crowd. Honor mattered because reputation mattered. And reputation mattered because nobles were basically living inside a never-ending performance review. And the Bourbons, well, they were notoriously dramatic about it. One chronicle mentions a Bourbon who challenged a rival because the rival disagreed too loudly during a council meeting. Another record claims a Bourbon lord once threatened a duel because someone joked that he couldn't grow a proper beard. Historians still debate whether that story is accurate or just court gossip blown out of proportion. Honestly, with this family, either is possible. As you move through the courtyard, the spectators fade into shadow, and you catch the echo of metal striking metal. The clash is sharp, anxious, the kind that digs into your chest and won't let go. The Bourbon combatant fights like someone carrying centuries of irritation, swift, heated, too sure of himself. And you realize something important. These duels weren't just about anger. They were about control, about proving the family wasn't to be underestimated, about showing the world that Bourbon pride was sharp enough to draw blood if necessary. But dueling wasn't the only battlefield. Honor seeped into every corner of Bourbon life. Family feuds erupted over trivial matters, inheritance details, seating arrangements, who stood closest to the king, who looked at whom for too long, who looked away too quickly. If you think family gatherings are tense now, imagine attending a 14th-century Bourbon dinner where one wrong joke could start a 4-generation feud. You wander into a chamber where tapestries soften the walls, their colors deep and heavy. Here, disputes play out verbally instead of physically. But the tension is the same. Nobles argue in crisp, polite voices that somehow feel more threatening than any sword swing. A Bourbon matriarch sits in the corner, her gaze sharp as she silently judges every word. She knows each alliance, each grudge, each opportunity hidden inside the chaos. The women of the Bourbon family, often underestimated in the official accounts, could wield social tension as effectively as any blade. A single raised eyebrow from one of them could ruin someone's month. You pause near a window, your breath fogging faintly on the cool glass. Below, two young Bourbon cousins argue about something. It's hard to tell. Maybe land rights, maybe pride, maybe who gets the family hunting falcon on weekends. Their gestures grow more animated. And for a moment, it looks like they might start throwing fists. This, too, became a pattern. The Bourbons rose in influence. Yes, but they also fractured. Every attempt to defend their honor created fissures inside the family itself. Cracks that widened as each generation tried to outdo the one before. One historian once suggested that the Bourbon obsession with honor was their downfall long before the revolution ever touched them. Another argued that duels and disputes were normal for nobles of the time. And the Bourbons weren't particularly worse than their peers. But when you stand here, watching tension ripple through their world like heatwaves on stone, it's hard not to feel a deeper truth. The family was always at war with itself. You step through an archway and enter a long, dim hall lined with portraits. Each face, stern, arrogant, sorrowful, triumphant, seems to watch you with the same unspoken message. Honor was everything. Even when it destroyed us. Their eyes follow you, reminding you of how many Bourbons died in fights they didn't need to pick. Battles they could have walked away from. Conflicts that were more about pride than necessity. Like ghosts whispering regrets into the corners of your mind. Outside, the duel ends. A cry, a thud, a gasp from the crowd. Someone's pride has been defended, someone else's life has slipped into the dust. And for what? A slight? A rumor? A gesture misinterpreted? This is how the Bourbon curse burrowed in, not in sudden tragedies, but in the repeated, exhausting pattern of conflict fueled by pride. You turn away from the courtyard and feel that familiar tug in the air again. The family's future is pulling you onward, toward the age of brilliance. The age of spectacle. The era where the Bourbon name would blaze across Europe like a sun. But suns cast shadows, and in that shadow, this obsession with honor will shape the Bourbon destiny, sharpening the curse that is slowly, steadily forming around them. You step forward, the echo of clashing swords still humming under your skin, and walk into the next chapter of their unraveling. You feel the air warm as you step forward, the chill of dueling courts and clenched jaws fading behind you. The walls around you stretch higher, gleaming with gold, and suddenly the corridors don't feel cramped or dangerous anymore, they feel theatrical. Overwhelming. Like someone decided that subtlety was a peasant word and banned it from royal vocabulary. Because now, you're entering the age of the Sun King. And if you thought the Bourbons were dramatic before, well, brace yourself. The light changes first. It floods every corner of your mind's palace with a honeyed glow so bright you instinctively blink. This is Louis XIV's France, where sunlight isn't just a natural phenomenon, it's branding. You walk across polished marble floors that feel warm under your steps. As though the rooms themselves remember the king's obsession with radiance. Everything you see is designed to reflect, refract, shimmer, impress. Even the dust motes in the air look like they're trying to be part of the aesthetic. You enter the Hall of Mirrors, its imagined version anyway, and your breath catches. Because now the Bourbon story has stepped into grandeur so blinding it almost hides the cracks beneath. Almost. This place glitters like a jewel box thrown open, each facet reflecting not just beauty but ambition polished to a dangerous shine. Louis XIV stands at the center of it all in your mind's eye, towering wig, embroidered coat, expression that could melt steel. If confidence were a physical object, he would have used it as a weapon. He moves through the hall with deliberate grace, each step echoing in a rhythm that says, "I am the sun. You are the planets. Rotate accordingly." And everyone does. Courtiers bow so deeply you worry they'll dislocate a vertebra. Nobles hover behind him like enamored moths. Even the walls seem to lean inward. Listening, you almost laugh because honestly, it's over the top, but that's the point. Louis XIV didn't just rule France, he performed it. Yet as you glide beside him through the golden light, you feel something colder beneath the shine, a shadow tucked behind the curtains, pressed into the seams of this glittering world. Because even while Louis XIV turned the Bourbon name into a sunburst, the curse simmered quietly underneath, whispering, waiting, tightening its grip on the lineage. The first hint of trouble is the exhaustion. Not yours, the court's. You hear the murmurs of nobles forced to attend rituals from dawn until late in the night. Rising ceremonies, dressing ceremonies, walking ceremonies. Everything Louis did was a spectacle. And everyone had to participate. Willingly or not, nobles tripped over themselves trying to gain favor. Spending fortunes they didn't have just to wear the right lace or buy the right shoes. It was a majestic prison, gilded. Yes, but a prison nonetheless. You stroll past a group of women whispering behind their fans. Each fan a fluttering shield of secrets. One complains that her husband has spent so much money trying to impress the king that they might have to sell their estate. Another worries that their son offended a rival family by standing too close to the wrong tapestry. In this world, minor missteps could become catastrophes. Louis XIV didn't need to crush his enemies, he let their own desperation do the job. And while all of this dazzles you, something quiet tugs at your attention. The Bourbon family is changing. The raw ambition of earlier generations is being smothered under layers of etiquette and performance. Even the smallest decisions must be filtered through the expectations of Versailles. The family rises, yes, so high that the sunlight itself crowns them, but loses the flexibility that might have saved them later. They become a dynasty trapped in its own glow. You wander into Louis XIV's private chambers, where the light dims slightly and reality feels more intimate. Here, the Sun King ages, slowly at first, then abruptly, like time itself decided to remind him he was mortal after all. The room smells faintly of incense and fatigue. His footsteps grow heavier, his decisions more stubborn. And his family? They start to thin out. Literally, Louis outlives his son, and his grandson, and nearly his great-grandson. People whispered it was a curse. A string of bizarre tragedies tearing through the Bourbon line with impeccable, unsettling timing. Historians still debate whether it was disease, poor medical practices, or something more psychological. A dynasty buckling under the pressure of its own perfection. But as you stand here watching the aged king stare into a mirror that reflects every burden he ever carried, you sense the curse's outline forming more clearly. Grandeur hides nothing, it only makes the fractures shimmer more brightly. You follow a corridor into the gardens of Versailles, where fountains roar in the distance, their spray heavy in the air. The manicured hedges stretch like labyrinth walls. Elegant and suffocating, the king walks here sometimes in your imagination. Hands clasped, eyes distant, he built a world so grand that no one dared question him. Yet even he couldn't escape the creeping realization that his dynasty stood on feet more fragile than marble. He lost heirs, he lost friends, he lost pieces of himself. And as you inhale the scent of trimmed roses, perfect, symmetrical, but lifelessly controlled, you understand the shadow of the Sun King. The brilliance blinded a nation. It blinded the Bourbons themselves. But the shadow remained, deepening behind the gold leaf and formalities, waiting for the right moment to expand. When you turn back toward the glowing palace, you feel a hush sweeping over you, not peaceful, but anticipatory. The Bourbon curse has been patient. But now, with the Sun King's shadow stretching long across Europe, it begins to stir. The dynasty will shine brighter than ever, and then the cracks will split open wider than anyone expected. And you step back into the echoing halls. carrying the faint warmth of that artificial sun as the story pulls you toward the next unraveling of a family that rose too high, too fast, and too close to its own destruction. You step away from the glowing halls of Versailles and feel the air cool again, soft, unsettling, as though someone dimmed the world just enough to make every sound feel louder. The sunlight of Louis XIV fades behind you, and now you're walking through rooms thick with absence. Heavy drapes, hushed conversations, the echo of footsteps that don't quite reach the far walls. Because this chapter of the Bourbon story isn't about glory or performance. It's about something far stranger, far darker, the heirs who vanished. You can almost hear the silence first, the kind that settles over a palace when grief becomes too common to shock anyone. Already, the court is whispering about patterns, uncomfortable ones. You glide into a chamber where a cradle once stood, the curtains still faintly swaying as if rocked by a memory. Another heir gone, another funeral, another excuse from doctors who barely understood the human body at all. And as you walk, the feeling clings to you. This isn't ordinary tragedy. This is a shadow with a sense of timing. You cross into a long gallery, and the portraits watch you with hollowed eyes, young princes with solemn expressions. Little girls whose futures never unfolded. Faces from branches of the Bourbon tree that snapped far too early. Louis XIV had outlived his son, his grandson, and nearly all the small, fragile threads meant to carry the dynasty forward. That kind of pattern doesn't go unnoticed. People whispered the word malediction like it was forbidden. Others blamed fate, a few blamed politics, and some, quietly, blamed the Bourbons themselves. You pause by a window where the glass fogs gently under your breath. Outside, the gardens of Versailles remain flawlessly manicured, as if the earth itself were ordered to ignore sorrow. But inside these walls, the losses were relentless. You hear faint echoes of physicians murmuring diagnoses that sound more like guesses. Smallpox, measles, fevers, bad humors, and one illness described vaguely as the kind that comes for children at night. Not exactly helpful. Medieval and early modern medicine was basically a dice roll with herbs. And yet, some of the deaths were strange, unusually clustered, unexpected. People noticed. People talked. One diary mentions a Bourbon heir falling ill mere days after a political argument between factions at court. Another letter hints at poison, delivered not by rival nobles, but by someone close. Too close. Historians still debate whether these writings reflect paranoia or something darker threading through the palace halls. But walking here now, you can feel the lingering chill, a sense that something was picking off the family with purposeful patience. You drift toward a nursery, its imagined walls painted with scenes of hunting dogs and cherubs, cheerful images that feel painfully out of place. A rocking horse sits abandoned, one wooden ear chipped. You reach out, brushing your fingers over its worn surface. You can almost hear the soft laughter of children who never grew old enough to sit on actual thrones. A chill crawls up your spine, and for a brief moment, the room feels crowded, not with people, but with the weight of all the futures cut short. Outside in the hallway, two nobles whisper. One mentions the Dauphin's unexpected decline. Another mutters that too many heirs have died too close together. You hear the sharp inhale of a woman who overhears them. clutching her rosary like it's a shield. The court was terrified, not openly. Never openly, but in the tight set of their shoulders. The way conversations died when servants passed by. And the Bourbons themselves? They started to look over their shoulders more often. Their confidence eroding into uneasy glances at anyone who stepped too close. You continue walking and find yourself beside the bed where the Grand Dauphin once lay. A powerful man, built to rule, undone by a fever that seemed to burn through him in days. Some said it was contaminated drinking water. Others said he'd simply inherited weak constitution. But a few murmured something else, that the Bourbon blood itself was flawed, carrying a streak of misfortune impossible to ignore. The truth? Still debated, always debated. Historians argue over letters, medical notes, rumors scribbled in margins, but the pattern remains, unsettling in its consistency. And then there were the smaller tragedies, heirs lost to accidents. A fall down a staircase. A hunting mishap. A horse that suddenly bolted. You try to shake the sense of déjà vu as each story blends into another. It feels rehearsed, cyclical, like the curse was writing the script long before anyone dared name it. You drift into a chapel lit by soft candlelight, shadows flickering against carved saints. Here, prayers were whispered by desperate mothers, exhausted kings, tutors who had already buried too many students. The air smells of wax, incense, and a lingering sorrow that never fully dissipated. Someone kneels at the altar in your mind's eye, hands shaking, whispering for protection over the last surviving heir. A protection that history shows didn't last long. The Bourbons were rising toward the height of royal power. But their bloodline was thinning. Too many funerals, too many unanswered questions. The line that should have been branching out like a mighty tree was shrinking instead, curling inward like something scorched. You step back from the altar, the candles flickering more violently as if reacting to a draft or a memory. And you finally understand the heart of this chapter. The curse wasn't sudden. It seeped in slowly, loss by loss, tightening around the dynasty like a quiet, calculated embrace. The Sun King's light cast long shadows. And in those shadows something began to feed. The Bourbon line gained power, prestige, territory, but lost its foundation, its future, its children. You walk toward the exit of this imagined chapel, feeling the air grow heavier around you. Like the walls themselves mourn the heirs who never lived long enough to wear their inherited crowns. When you cross the threshold, that weight doesn't lift, it follows you, clinging like the smoke from snuffed candles. Because the line of succession is starting to crack, and where cracks appear, something darker always slips through. The Bourbon curse isn't a whisper anymore. It's a presence, and it's just getting started. You step out of that dim chapel of vanished heirs, and the atmosphere shifts again. This time into something hotter. Crowded, almost sticky with intrigue. It's the sensation of too many secrets pressing against the same walls. Breathing the same perfumed air. You're walking into the inner chambers of the Bourbon world now, where the real battles aren't fought on muddy fields or dueling courtyards, but in whispered conversations behind gilded doors. Here, in the tangle of salons, boudoirs, private apartments, and hidden staircases, the Bourbon curse grows a new pair of claws, quiet ones. The first thing you notice is the noise. Not loud, Not obvious, just constant. A rustle of silk, a laugh too light to be honest. Shoes tapping down corridors where no one is supposed to walk. It's the kind of background sound that makes you want to check over your shoulder. Even though everyone here looks harmless. They aren't, of course. But that's the trick of court life. The most dangerous people never look dangerous. You drift into a salon glowing with candlelight, where nobles sit on velvet chairs arranged in a perfectly unnatural circle. Painted fans flutter like gossiping butterflies. A minister clears his throat with the deliberate intent of someone about to cause a problem. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, allegiances shift like sand. The Bourbons might care about honor on the dueling field. But in these rooms, honor is optional. Influence is the real game. You notice a pair of courtiers leaning together, pretending to admire a tapestry while whispering about which Bourbon cousin has fallen out of favor this week. Another group is debating whether a new mistress will charm the king or ruin him. Their voices drip with fascination and fear. Because one wrong whisper here could ruin a career. A misplaced letter could end a marriage. A fabricated rumor could topple a minister. And the Bourbon dynasty, already struggling with disappearing heirs, is now being hollowed out from the inside by ambition, jealousy, and the relentless pursuit of royal attention. As you drift closer to the firelight, you see Madame de Maintenon, Louis XIV's later life confidante, her eyes sharp beneath serene composure. Was she a stabilizing force? A manipulator? Historians still argue. Some praise her influence. Others accuse her of tightening the king's rigidity and moral strictness. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the middle, wrapped in layers of secrecy thicker than the velvet curtains behind her. She represents the court's shift, once flamboyant and hedonistic, now stricter, colder, more controlled, and this shift began rearranging the power dynamics with unsettling precision. You slip through a side door into a corridor where echoes bounce strangely. This is where the real scheming thrives. Behind walls thin enough to overhear confessions but thick enough to deny you ever heard them. You follow an imagined servant carrying a tray of wine, and you can practically sense the tension radiating off him. Servants knew everything, too much. In fact, their knowledge made them both indispensable and expendable, depending on who needed a rumor suppressed or a secret delivered. A single overheard phrase could ignite a scandal. A single scandal could fracture the Bourbon grip on stability. You turn into the Queen's apartments, elegant, almost serene, but not truly peaceful. The Queen, whoever she was at this moment in Bourbon history, sits still as a painting while ladies in waiting adjust her hair. Behind their smiles, their minds race. Who is favored? Who is slipping? Who is whispering behind whose back? Court women wield soft power sharper than steel, shaping public perception, influencing marriage alliances, and steering the emotional lives of kings. One misplaced glance here could do more damage than a failed treaty. Occasionally, you hear laughter from deeper inside the palace, a bright, brittle sound that never seems to last long. This is where the famed mistresses of the French court leave their signature. The Marquise de Montespan, bold and seductive, whose influence rose like flame and fell like ash. The Duchess de Bourgogne, charming yet volatile, women who could shift political tides by stepping into a room. Their power was immense, and incredibly unstable. When they fell, they often dragged allies with them. The Bourbons were constantly navigating this tide of feminine influence, sometimes using it to their advantage, sometimes drowning beneath it. Historians still debate which intrigues were exaggerated and which were catastrophically real. Some argue that later writers embellished these stories for drama. Others insist the court's scheming was worse than anyone recorded. But as you walk through these hallways, you feel something undeniable. The Bourbon dynasty was exhausting itself, burning energy trying to maintain control over a kingdom while fighting invisible battles inside its own palace. You enter a quieter room, a writing chamber. Small, cluttered with parchment, here lies the evidence of the era's real weapon: letters. So many letters, some affectionate, some venomous, some coded so cleverly that even modern historians can't be certain what they truly meant. These letters traveled through secret routes, carried by trembling messengers who prayed not to get caught. Because if the wrong person intercepted a note, careers ended, reputations imploded, lives changed overnight. You trail your fingers over a desk covered in sealing wax. Somewhere in these pages are the secrets that shaped France. Who influenced the king? Who sabotaged the dauphin? Who maneuvered to control access to the royal children? The Bourbon family wasn't just ruling, it was surviving its own court. You sense the emotional toll even now. The heirs who didn't vanish physically often vanished emotionally into pressure, paranoia, and expectation. The adults battled each other. The children grew up in a maze of politics. And all the while, the Bourbon curse, whether real or imagined, deepened its roots in this soil of manipulation. When you step back into the corridor, the air feels heavy, perfume mixed with secrets, candle smoke twisted with fear. The palace is beautiful, but it's also suffocating. Each footstep you take echoes like a warning. And as you move forward, leaving the intrigues behind, you understand that this wasn't just background noise in Bourbon history. It was a slow, steady erosion, eating away at unity, trust, and the very foundation the dynasty needed to survive what was coming next. You take one more step, and the scent of war begins to drift toward you. The intrigue fades behind, but its damage lingers like an invisible bruise. The Bourbon curse isn't subtle anymore. It's evolving, and soon, it will demand a much higher price. You move away from Marie Antoinette's chamber, and the atmosphere shifts again, this time not into sorrow or superstition, but into something far more brittle. The air feels thin, stretched, almost metallic, like the moment before glass shatters. The palace around you groans softly under its own weight. Somewhere deep in the stone, there's a vibration, the pulse of a kingdom losing faith. You step into a corridor where sunlight no longer warms the walls. It feels cooler here, dimmer, as if France's trust itself has been dimmed. Once, the people believed the Bourbon crown was ordained, divine, unquestionable, inevitable. But now, you feel the first cracks in that belief under your feet. The monarchy hasn't fallen yet, but it's wobbling, and everyone, absolutely everyone, feels it. You enter a council chamber where ministers gather around a heavy table. The air is clogged with tension and ink fumes. Papers are scattered everywhere, filled with tax proposals, debt figures, and pleas for reform. Ministers argue in strained voices. Should the nobles be taxed? Should privileges be stripped? Should the estate's general be summoned? Every question feels like opening a trapdoor. Every decision seems to create more enemies than solutions. Louis XVI sits at the far end in your imagination, well-meaning, earnest, and utterly overwhelmed. His fingers drum nervously on the polished wood. His advisors speak over each other. Some urge decisive reform. Others warn that change will destroy the monarchy. A few want to maintain the old order at all costs. And the king? He nods, hesitates, reverses, delays. You understand now. The Bourbon curse isn't only in vanished heirs or scandals. It's in indecision. Cracks are widening because no one knows how to close them. You drift into the hallways of court life, and the whispers follow you like shadows. Courtiers complain that the king is too weak. Ministers say he is too stubborn. The clergy claims he is too lenient. The nobles insist he is too reformist. Everyone wants something. No one agrees. And beneath it all, a murmur rises from the streets outside Versailles, low at first. Then louder. Then impossible to ignore. France is starving. Bread prices climb. Wages fall. The winters grow harsher. Parents go hungry so their children can eat. And here at Versailles, the gap between palace luxury and public misery becomes too wide to justify with ceremony. The people grumble, then they shout, then they rage. You wander into the Queen's private garden, where Antoinette once sought brief comfort among roses. Now the roses look wilted around the edges. Servants move quietly, urgently. Rumors about the Austrian woman swirl like gnats in the humid air. Every misstep from the court fuels resentment. Every lavish purchase becomes evidence of indifference. The Queen is no longer seen as a symbol of grace. She becomes an emblem of excess. You feel her anxiety tightening the space, draining the color from the flowers themselves. Historians still debate how responsible the royal couple truly were for France's crisis. Many argue the roots ran far deeper: decades of war, economic mismanagement, a rigid class structure, a tax system built like a Jenga tower missing half its blocks. Others maintain the Bourbons accelerated their own downfall with tone-deaf decisions. But one thing everyone agrees on, by now. Trust between ruler and people was collapsing like wet paper. You pass through a gallery lined with tapestries depicting France's past glories, victories, coronations, alliances. But now the fabric looks frayed. The colors dull. The past no longer supports the present. You hear echoes of debates from the philosophies, ideas about liberty, equality, reason, representation. Enlightenment ideals waft through these corridors like smoke slipping under doors. Ideas are dangerous things when a kingdom is fragile. Then you step into a small, dim alcove where Louis XVI prays alone. His shoulders shake, not from fear of losing power, but from fear of failing his people. He truly wanted to do right. But wanting isn't doing, and doing requires decisiveness, courage, and unity, qualities the Bourbon system had been bleeding out for years. Outside this alcove, a servant races past with news from Paris. Bread riots, angry crowds, pamphlets accusing the monarchy of betrayal. The servant's face is pale. His hands tremble. You realize how close the storm is now. You follow the tremors into a room overlooking the palace gates. From here, you see the imagined glow of torches. Not yet in violence, but in anger. People gather in restless clusters. Not rebels, not revolutionaries, just citizens, cold, hungry, desperate. Their murmurs rise through the night air like a warning chant. The dynasty hears them, but doesn't respond, not quickly enough, not clearly enough. The monarchy, built on divine right, seems unable to comprehend that divine right means nothing when the divine is starving. Between the palace and the people lies a widening canyon of misunderstanding. The Bourbons think time will fix it. The people think time has already run out. And as you step back into the heart of Versailles, you feel the walls contracting, the atmosphere tightening. Faith, once the foundation of Bourbon rule, is crumbling. Not just faith in the monarchy. Faith in the future. Faith in survival. This is not yet the fall. Not yet the revolution. But the monarchy is standing on a thin, cracking sheet of ice. And the next chapter will bring the footsteps that finally break it. You take your next step into the corridor. And suddenly the air feels different, charged, electric, humming with a tension that has outgrown whispers and candlelit fears. The walls around you seem to tremble with distant echoes. Like the palace itself is bracing. Because everything that has simmered beneath the surface, famine, frustration, debt, distrust, desperation, is about to boil over. And you feel it even before you see anything. The revolution is coming. You emerge onto a balcony overlooking an imagined Paris in early dawn. The light is pale, watery, fragile, but the city beneath it is anything but. Crowds gather in the streets in restless, pulsing waves. Children cry. Bakers shout over empty shelves. Mothers clutch thin loaves as if they're trying to hold their lives together. The smell of smoke hangs heavy, not from fire, but from too many people burning whatever they can find just to stay warm. You lean on the railing, and the murmurs from below grow sharper, angrier. The people aren't whispering anymore. They're demanding, they're pleading, they're roaring. Bread. Equality. The king must act. The queen must answer. Justice. You move back inside the palace where ministers rush past you. Pale and frantic. Their wigs sit crooked on their heads. Their papers shake in their hands. Everything feels unsteady. Louis XVI stands in the middle of a chamber, surrounded by advisors who contradict each other so fiercely you wonder how any mortal could keep up. One urges concessions. One urges force. One urges delay. Another urges prayer. Louis hesitates, again and again, trapped not by apathy but by fear of choosing wrong. Yet in revolutions, hesitation is the most dangerous choice of all. You slip into Marie Antoinette's private salon, where she paces in quick, tight circles. Her gown whispers against the floor like frantic breath. She reads the latest pamphlets, ugly caricatures of herself, lies printed in ink thick enough to seep into the nation's veins. She had become, against her will, the villain in France's story. And every step she takes now feels measured against a rising wave she cannot outrun. You watch her glance at her children's rooms, her eyes softening with fear. For all her flaws, and she had many, she loved them fiercely. And in this moment, fear for them eclipses fear for her crown. You drift further into the palace, where nobles debate whether to flee. Some have already smuggled out their jewelry. Others have booked carriages for the night. A few claim the people will calm down, that this is temporary, that the rabble will tire themselves out. Their delusion hangs thick in the air, like the scent of spoiled perfume. Because outside the palace gates, something enormous is shifting. You step outside again, and this time the crowd has multiplied. Hundreds, then thousands. A sea of citizens, men in rough coats, women with sleeves rolled up, young radicals with makeshift weapons. They surge through the streets toward the Bastille, driven by hunger, hope, fury, fear. A fortress that had long symbolized royal tyranny stands tall before them, but not for long. You hear the roar of cannon fire in the distance, the rattle of musket shots, the crack of wood breaking, the crash of gates collapsing. Paris shakes, smoke pours into the sky like a herald. The walls of the Bastille crumble, stone by stone, and the people cry out, not just in victory, but in release, centuries of pressure erupting at once. You watch as the news travels like lightning. A breathless messenger arrives at Versailles, stumbling over his words. The Bastille has fallen. The court freezes. Someone gasps. Someone faints. Someone whispers, "This is the end." Louis XVI stares, pale, stunned, as if the world has tilted under his feet. He asks quietly, almost childishly, "Is it a revolt?" "No, sire," comes the answer. "It is a revolution." You feel the walls around you shift with that word, revolution, like a new presence entering the palace. It doesn't creep, it storms. You move through room after room where the atmosphere grows heavier. Rumors circulate about mobs marching toward the palace, about ministers resigning, about nobles fleeing, about the royal guard wavering. The king tries to address the crisis, but his voice is drowned out by forces far larger than any speech. Outside, the people chant louder, closer. Inside, the Bourbons buckle. Historians still debate the exact tipping point, whether it was famine, debt, Enlightenment ideals, arrogance, or sheer inevitability. But as you stand here, feeling the revolution's heartbeat pounding through the palace floors, you understand the truth. It was all of it. Every fracture in the Bourbon lineage, every vanished heir, every scandal, every war, every refusal to reform, every echo of the curse tightening its grip. You move toward a window overlooking the palace gates. Torches flare, steel glints, voices swell. The air tastes like iron and storm. The Bourbon dynasty has entered its final battlefield, not a field of cannons and cavalry, but a battlefield of crowds, ideals, and unstoppable momentum. The revolution has broken through. And nothing, not prayer, not privilege, not lineage, can stop what comes next. You turn away from the window as the palace trembles gently underneath your feet. Because the fall is no longer approaching. It has begun. You walk deeper into the palace, and the tremor beneath your feet grows stronger, no longer the distant rumble of crowds gathering, but something closer, heavier, like the slow, deliberate heartbeat of fate. The corridors feel narrower now, their gold leaf edges dimming as if the light itself is retreating. Because this is the chapter where the Bourbon story stops trembling and finally cracks. Louis XVI, the last king of the ancient regime, is waiting. Not on a throne, not in a grand hall, but in a small, suffocating chamber where maps, letters, and half-formed plans lie scattered like fallen leaves. His face is pale in your imagination, his eyes ringed with exhaustion, his hands clasped together in a way that reveals more desperation than royal dignity. He is a king surrounded by decisions he cannot make and consequences he cannot escape. And yet, even now, he hopes. You feel him cling to that hope in the air, thin as thread. Then the door bursts open with a gasp of cold morning air. A messenger, trembling, announces that thousands are marching toward Versailles. Women, armed with kitchen knives and muskets, furious from hunger, carrying the will of Paris in their voices. Men following behind them with pikes and torches. They don't want promises. They want change. They want accountability. They want the king. You walk the corridors as frantic guards rally. Courtiers scream, and the queen gathers her children in trembling hands. The palace feels suddenly alive, panicked, chaotic, like a beast waking up in terror. Then the shouting begins outside. A roar. A crash. A scream. The palace gates shudder under the force of the mob. Muskets crack, glass shatters, and history bursts in with muddy shoes and fury burning behind its eyes. You watch Louis XVI move through the chaos, trailed by guards who beg him to flee. But he doesn't. He steps onto a balcony instead, facing the seething sea below. Torches hiss, pikes sway, thousands of eyes pierce him, and you feel the weight settle onto his shoulders, the crushing realization that he is no longer a ruler standing above his people, but a man standing before a storm. He offers promises, concessions, bread. The crowd roars back, not with approval, but with demand. They want the king and queen to return to Paris. Not tomorrow. Not soon. Now. Louis looks at the faces below and sees no option. The dynasty is not negotiating anymore. It's surviving. You follow as he and Marie Antoinette climb into a carriage. Their children pressed close, their guards trembling. The wheels roll forward, the mob surrounds them, and the royal family is dragged, slowly, symbolically, humiliatingly, back to Paris. Back to the city that will judge them. You enter the Tuileries Palace now. A gloomy, drafty building that feels more like a cage than a home. Gone are the fountains of Versailles, the glitter of salons, the lavish gardens. The Tuileries smells faintly of damp stone and smoke from nearby streets. Every window is watched, every movement monitored, every whisper reported. Louis XVI tries to rule from here. He signs decrees. He meets ministers. He tries to appear calm. But each attempt at leadership only exposes how powerless he has become. You see him hunched at a desk late at night, candlelight flickering over documents he doesn't fully understand, reforms he fears to enact, letters he doesn't dare send. Marie Antoinette stands behind him, hands tight on his shoulders, urging him to act, to resist, to fight for the throne. But every path they choose seems wrong, too slow, too cautious, too bold, too foreign. Historians still debate whether Louis XVI was a good man trapped in a bad time, or a weak king whose indecision sealed the dynasty's fate. You sense the debate in the room itself. Every corner feels like an argument frozen in midair. Then comes the flight to Varennes. You follow them through the palace at midnight as they disguise themselves. slip into the carriage, and flee toward the frontier. The wheels rattle over cobblestones. Every mile feels like a prayer. If they succeed, the monarchy might survive. If they fail, the carriage is stopped in the town of Varennes. A single recognition, one guard's suspicion, one candle held too high, and the entire escape collapses. They are captured, escorted back to Paris under the watchful eyes of furious crowds. This time, the people don't shout for bread. They shout for justice. And justice, in the revolutionary sense, has a very specific shape. Now the air around you grows colder, sharper. You step into a hall where the National Assembly debates the king's fate. Voices rise like clashing swords. Some argue for mercy. Many argue for death. The word treason hangs in the air like frost. Louis is brought before them, not as a king, but as citizen caput. He answers questions calmly, almost too calmly. His composure feels heartbreaking, or maddening, depending on who you ask. The debate rages for days. Then the vote comes. Guilty. By a narrow margin. Execution. By a wider one. You feel your chest tighten as you follow him through the corridors on his final morning. The sky is gray. The drums beat a slow, merciless rhythm. Crowds gather in the thousands, some solemn, some eager, some numb. Louis ascends the scaffold with steady steps. He tries to speak, but the drums drown him out. The executioner raises the blade. You don't hear the fall. You only feel the silence that follows. A silence so deep it seems to swallow the entire dynasty. The Bourbon line has reached the point of no return. Not metaphorically. Literally. The curse that once whispered now roars. And as you step back from the scaffold, the world around you reshapes itself again, not into a palace, but into the long shadow the Bourbons will leave behind. Because the fall of the last king is not the end. It is the beginning of the echo. You step away from the scaffold, and the world around you changes with a slow, almost vertiginous pull, like history is tilting, draining the color from one era and pouring it into another. The palace halls vanish, the roar of the Paris crowd fades, and suddenly you're walking through quieter, emptier spaces where the Bourbon name still exists, but only as an echo. A ghost trailing behind those who fled. Exile has a sound, a texture, a temperature. And for the Bourbons who survived the revolution, it feels like stepping into a cold, foreign dawn with nothing but their titles and memories to keep them warm. You find yourself on a dirt road outside the French border. The winter wind slicing across your face. Carriages rumble past, filled with nobles clutching bundles of jewelry, hastily tied trunks, and terrified children wrapped in too thin blankets. These are the émigrés, the scattered remnants of a dynasty that once ruled with absolute authority. Now they flee not from hunger or war, but from their own people. The Bourbons among them sit stiffly, staring straight ahead, unable to comprehend how quickly their world vanished. One young prince murmurs that this exile is temporary. Another insists they will return triumphantly. Their confidence feels brittle, like porcelain rattling inside the carriage. You walk alongside them as the road winds toward Germany, Austria, England, places where exiled royalty hope to find protection or support. But the reality greets them like a cruel draft. Foreign courts are polite and distant. They offer sympathy, not solutions, lodging, but not legions, tea, but not armies. You enter a drafty manor in Koblenz, where exiled nobles gather around a long table. Maps stretch across the wooden surface, candles burn low. They speak of counter-revolution, of raising armies, of retaking Paris. Their plans swirl with the desperation of men talking themselves out of despair. Every proposal is bold, every strategy is flawed, and every discussion ends with the same heavy silence. They have no real power anymore. A Bourbon cousin stands at the far end, trembling slightly as he reads aloud a letter smuggled from Paris. Supporters executed, properties seized, former allies imprisoned. He folds the letter with shaking hands. No one speaks. You feel the curse lingering here, not as calamity, but as emptiness, a vacuum, a dynasty cut from its soil. You step out into the manor's hallway, where women in faded gowns whisper quietly, wondering if they will ever see France again. Children ask when they can go home. No one answers. The walls of exile don't echo, they absorb. Then, as night falls in your imagination, you walk into a small study where the Count of Provence, future Louis XVIII, sits hunched over a desk. He's not ruling a kingdom. He's managing a household, scraping funds, perfecting declarations that few will read. He dips his quill in ink and writes with stiff dignity, trying to preserve a monarchy that now exists only on parchment. He signs his name with a flourish that feels too large for the tiny room. Historians still debate how seriously European powers took the exiled Bourbons in these years. Some say they were seen as burdens. Others say they were valuable bargaining chips. But as you stand beside this dim desk, you sense the truth. The Bourbons had become symbols. Not rulers, not leaders. Symbols of a past most nations weren't sure they wanted back. You wander outside again, across wet cobblestones shimmering in lantern light. You hear the sound of music drifting from a nearby tavern. Parisian émigrés trying to dance away grief. Lavish dances in cramped rooms. Laughter that cracks at the edges. These are people clinging to rituals of a life that no longer exists. Through a frosted window, you catch sight of a Bourbon princess sitting alone. Her back straight but her eyes distant. She grips a pendant, her last piece of home. She whispers something you can't hear, but you know its shape. A question with no answer. When you move on, the scene shifts again, this time to England. Rain patters softly against the windows of a quiet estate where more exiles live. Here, the Bourbons try to adapt. Some learn English. Some stalk the halls in restless frustration. Some fall ill, worn thin by stress. And some, those who once commanded armies and commanded rooms, find themselves reduced to polite guests in foreign drawing rooms. You hear one nobleman confess to another. Perhaps it was never meant to last. The other scoffs loudly. But you hear the tremor beneath the scoff. Doubt has teeth. You follow these exiles across years, years of waiting, planning, despairing, hoping. Revolutionaries rise. Governments fall. Paris changes shape and rulers like a stage with too many scene swaps. And through it all, the Bourbons hover at the edges of Europe, watching their homeland slip further into transformations they can no longer control. The curse feels different now, not violent, not dramatic, slow, eroding, a quiet force that hollowed out the dynasty until only fragments remained, scattered across foreign soil like seeds that refused to root. Eventually, you find yourself in a dim parlor in Warsaw, where the last living son of Louis XVI, the young Louis XVII, is rumored still by some to be alive. The child who died in a revolutionary prison became a myth, a haunting possibility. People claim to see him in Paris, in Italy, in America. These stories spread not because they were true, but because the Bourbon echo refused to fade cleanly. Even in absence, it lingered. Historians still argue whether any of these claimants believed their own stories or were exploited by others seeking legitimacy. But the fact that people wanted to believe says everything about the psychological imprint the dynasty left behind. You step back into the night. Snow begins to fall, soft, unhurried flakes drifting onto abandoned codes. Stone walls, half-forgotten estates. Exile settles gently, but deeply, a burial of identity rather than bodies. The Bourbons are alive, but they are shadows, scattered, weakened, fading into the edges of Europe. And yet, something stirs on the horizon. Because history loves complications. And the Bourbon story, the one that should have ended, is about to flicker back to life. You step forward again, and the snow of exile melts into mist, reshaping the world around you. The scattered nobles, the abandoned estates, the hollowed hopes, they blur and dissolve like breath on cold glass. Because history, ever theatrical, isn't finished with the Bourbons yet. The dynasty that should have ended in the echo of the guillotine is about to be pulled back into the spotlight. But it won't return as a triumphant phoenix. No. It will come back as something stranger. A ghost of monarchy wearing the costume of power. You find yourself standing on a Paris street in 1814, the air humming with disorientation. The revolution has burned itself out. Napoleon, France's furious, brilliant comet, has blazed across Europe and finally fallen. The world is exhausted. Countries redraw borders like repairing torn maps. Armies limp home. Crowds stare at their hands as if surprised to find nothing left to grip. And in that uncertainty, a familiar whisper resurfaces. Bring back the Bourbons. You can almost hear Europe's leaders exhale as they speak the words. A monarchy, any monarchy, feels stable, traditional, predictable, or at least, more predictable than Napoleon, whose ambition consumed entire decades of history. So kings and ministers gather around grand tables, signing treaties with ink that smells faintly of relief. And in the margins, someone writes the sentence that will fling the Bourbons back into France. Louis XVIII shall be restored to the throne. You step into a carriage moving toward Paris. Inside sits Louis XVIII, brother of the executed king, uncle of the lost prince, survivor of decades of exile. His face is soft, swollen with illness, his body weakened by gout. But his eyes, those carry the old Bourbon spark. Not the blazing arrogance of the Sun King, but the weary flicker of a man who believes he was born for a role history kept postponing. He adjusts the cuff of his coat with stiff fingers, forcing a regal posture despite the ache. He knows the truth behind the curtains of celebration. He is not returning as a conquering monarch. He is returning because Europe needs a placeholder. A symbol, a ghost to anchor the shaken order. Still, The crowds gather as he enters Paris. Some cheer, some sigh, some stare in silence, calculating what this restoration might mean. You feel the unease radiating through the city, relief tangled with suspicion. After all, kings don't usually return from extinction. You walk beside Louis XVIII through the halls of the Tuileries Palace. The same palace where his brother once paced in terror. The rooms feel colder now, draftier, the ceilings too high for the shrunken weight of this restored monarchy. Courtiers kneel awkwardly, unsure how deep their bows should be. Ministers offer rehearsed loyalty. Everyone acts as if the Bourbon order has been fully restored, but you can feel the hollowness beneath the surface. This is a monarchy without its foundations. A crown balanced on shifting sand. A ghost restoration. Louis XVIII tries to rule wisely. Cautiously. He avoids the absolutism that doomed his ancestors. He tries to blend monarchy with constitutional restraint, performing a political balancing act that would exhaust a gymnast. But every decision angers someone. Royalists whisper that he's too liberal. Liberals hiss that he's too royalist. Bonapartists wait in the shadows like wolves. You step into a council meeting where advisors argue over restoring noble privileges. Louis XVIII presses his temples as voices clash. One demands revenge, another demands reconciliation. The king's face tightens. He knows any choice will ignite fury. And the Bourbon curse, subtle but alert, sharpens its teeth. Then, like a thunderclap in a quiet room, Napoleon escapes from Elba. The news breaks over the court like a tidal wave. Louis XVIII's face drains of color. Ministers drop papers. Guards freeze. Outside, Paris roars with rumors. Napoleon marches toward the capital, gathering support with terrifying speed. And Louis, poor, exhausted Louis, is forced to flee the very city he regained. For a moment, the restoration evaporates. Napoleon sweeps in. The empire flares up once more. The Bourbons vanish again. This interlude, history's bizarre 100-day hiccup, becomes another fracture in the dynasty. When Napoleon finally falls for good, Louis XVIII returns once more. But this time, even the illusion of strength is gone. You walk with him through his second restoration, and everything feels thinner, more fragile. The crowds are smaller. The trust is weaker. The monarchy is now a ghost wearing a velvet cloak. Bourbon power exists only on paper, in ceremonies, in the formality of protocol. Real authority has moved elsewhere, to the people, the press, the rising political classes. You drift into a dim chamber where Louis XVIII sits alone, struggling to rise from his chair. Pain carves deep lines in his face. He knows he is ruling the shadow of a kingdom that no longer believes in kings. When he dies, Charles X, another brother, takes the throne. You imagine him walking through Paris with a posture too straight for a world already bending away from monarchy. He tries to restore the old ways. The strict ways, the absolutist ways, and the curse, now watching closely, tugs the final thread. France revolts. The July Revolution of 1830 bursts through the streets like a long-suppressed scream. Barricades rise, flags burn, shots ring out, And Charles X, faced with a country that refuses to be ruled like it was before the sun rose on modernity, flees into exile. Again, you feel the echo of footsteps, fleeing kings, collapsing thrones, the heavy inevitability of a dynasty that cannot carve its place in a world that has outgrown it. The Bourbon Restoration ends not with a triumph, but with a sigh, a ghost briefly illuminated by candlelight, then swallowed again by history's darkness. And as you move toward the next corridor of this unraveling tale, the air grows still, anticipating the moment when the last branch of this royal bloodline begins to wither. Because the curse hasn't finished its work yet. It has one more chapter before it sleeps. You move onward, and the world seems to exhale, long, tired, almost relieved, as though history itself is settling into the slow, inevitable dimming of a once blinding flame. The halls around you shrink. The tapestries fade. The echo of royal footsteps becomes quieter, softer, more hesitant, because now you are entering the final narrowing of the Bourbon bloodline, the moment when greatness doesn't collapse in fire, but erodes, gently and tragically, like a shoreline disappearing grain by grain. The restoration is over. The throne has slipped from Bourbon hands for the last meaningful time. And what remains of the family stands in a world that no longer needs them. You find yourself walking along a quiet French countryside estate, far from Versailles, far from court life, far from the weight of crowns. This is where some of the last Bourbons spend their days, in manors surrounded by orchards, vineyards, and memories. The air is still, warm, almost too peaceful. Birds chitter, a fountain gurgles, but beneath the tranquility lies an ache, a sense of displacement that never fully leaves. You step into a dim drawing room where the aging Louis XVIII's successors once gathered. Charles X, exiled again after the July Revolution, wrote letters by candlelight insisting he still held the true claim. His handwriting trembles, whether from age, cold, or doubt isn't clear. He believed, fiercely, that the monarchy could return. But even as he wrote, Europe had already begun to move on. Charles X's son, the Dauphin Louis Antoine, wanders nearby in your imagination, pacing halls with a hollow expression. He was technically Louis XIX for about 20 minutes before he abdicated under pressure during the 1830 uprising, one of the shortest reigns in world history. A king in theory, a ghost in practice. His short-lived monarchy is a footnote, a whisper, a flicker of a candle the wind snuffed out too quickly. You wander on, and the rooms grow smaller. A few portraits hang crookedly. A few chairs sit draped in white cloth. The grandeur is gone. What remains is memory. You find the last true heir of the senior Bourbon line, Henri, the Count of Chambord. He sits in a modest chamber, pen in hand, posture stiff with dignity inherited from centuries of kings. Born into exile after his father was assassinated during the Revolution, he is a man raised on distant dreams of a throne he will never touch. Chambord becomes the final symbol of what the Bourbons once were and what they can never be again. Royalists rally behind him. Pamphlets proclaim him the rightful king. Monarchists write manifestos insisting France must reclaim its old order. But Henri is stubborn, almost tragically so. When offered the throne under a constitutional monarchy, He refuses unless France replaces its tricolor flag with the old white banner of Bourbon rule. A symbol, he insists, cannot be compromised. But symbols, like monarchies, are only as durable as the world around them. France refuses, the tricolor stays, and the last strong chance of a Bourbon restoration dissolves in a single stubborn breath. Historians still debate his choice. Was it principle? Pride? Or simply a man unwilling to accept that history had moved on without him? Whatever the answer, it sealed the dynasty's fate. You step outside into the twilight. The sky is soft, fading from blue to rose. The air smells of damp earth and fallen leaves. You hear the count of Chambord's footsteps as he walks through the garden, slow, thoughtful, lonely. He has wealth, comfort, admirers, but he does not have the one thing that defined his bloodline for centuries, a kingdom. The Bourbon tree, once vast and tangled, has been pruned down to a single fragile branch. And when Henri dies in 1883, that branch snaps. The senior Bourbon line ends. Not with a guillotine, not with a revolt, but with a quiet death in exile. A whisper. A closing door. You walk back through the estate as night settles deeper. The halls feel heavier without him. Like the house itself knows its purpose is gone. Dust gathers in corners. Portraits stare with fading defiance. A dynasty that once shaped Europe now exists only in distant cadet branches. In footnotes. In speculative debates about who would be king, if monarchy were still a thing. Some say the Bourbon curse ended with Henri. Others say it fulfilled itself completely, its purpose achieved, its prophecy closed. And some historians argue that the curse was nothing mystical at all. Merely a poetic way of describing political missteps, unlucky timing, and a dynasty unable to evolve. But standing here, in this dim estate where the last king that never was took his final breath, you feel something older, quieter, deeper. A sense that the Bourbons did not simply fall. They dissolved. Slowly. Quietly. Inevitably. A once mighty bloodline fading like the last ember of a dying fire. You turn away from the silent hallway, feeling the chill of the final unraveling settle into your bones. Because there is one last chapter to tell. Not about power, not about heirs, not about crowns, but about memory. About how a dynasty becomes a cautionary tale. And how a curse becomes a story that refuses to be forgotten. You take one final step, and the world around you shifts into something softer, quieter than all the wars. Scandals, vanished heirs, and uprisings that came before. The corridors of palaces dissolve. The echo of revolution fades. Even the silhouettes of exiled kings drift apart like mist touched by morning light. What remains is not a place, not a throne, not a crown. What remains is memory. You stand in a vast, dim archive that feels like the inside of time itself. Shelves stretch into the distance, each one stacked with documents, portraits, diaries, pamphlets, faded maps, forgotten proclamations. Dust dances in a shaft of pale light falling from nowhere and everywhere at once. The air feels cool, calm, almost reverent, like history has invited you into its quietest chamber. This, at last, is where the Bourbon curse settles. Not as a living force. Not as a whisper in the halls of Versailles. But as a legacy etched into paper and bone. You drift past a long table where old manuscripts lie open. One details the early rise of the family, bold, ambitious, brilliant. Another records the hollow fear of lost heirs. Another documents the revolution with clinical brutality. Together, they form a strange mosaic of glory and ruin, triumph and catastrophe, light and shadow, exactly the way curses often work, not supernatural, but cyclical. You pause beside a glass display case containing a cracked signet ring once worn by Louis XVI. It gleams faintly in the low light. This small object once symbolized absolute authority. Now it sits quietly inside a case. Its meaning decided not by kings but by the people who study kings. You lean closer, and the reflection that stares back at you is yours, not his. A faint reminder that the power of memory eventually belongs to those who inherit the story, not those who lived it. Across the chamber, you see a faded portrait of Marie Antoinette. The canvas is cracked, the colors dimmed by time, but her face remains steady, more human than the rumor-filled caricatures that haunted her during her lifetime. You feel a strange flicker of empathy. History softened her edges long after it sharpened them. Maybe that's what memory does. It edits. It corrects. It forgives in ways the present never can. You walk on, exploring shelves of correspondence, notes between ambassadors, secret letters from mistresses, coded messages in trembling handwriting. So much of the Bourbon world was built on paper trails, alliances drawn in ink, betrayals hidden behind gentle calligraphy, hopes pressed into wax seals. It is strange how something as fragile as paper can outlive empires. A faint breeze sweeps through the archive, fluttering loose pages like leaves in an autumn gust. The sound is gentle, soothing, and when you breathe it in, you sense how the Bourbon memory has shifted over the centuries. Once feared, once adored, once despised, now studied, questioned, humanized. The curse that once felt like fate now feels like story, still eerie, still uncanny, still threaded with tragedy, but softened by distance. You move further into the room, and the walls widen into a gallery lined with portraits from every chapter of Bourbon history. Robert of Clermont, Henry IV, Louis XIV, Louis XVI, the Count of Chambord, their faces blur together into one long line, each one carrying pride, ambition, flaws, wounds. You feel their presence not as ghosts, but as echoes. And the question begins to rise in your mind. Was the Bourbon curse ever real? You turn this thought over as you walk. Some historians argue it was nothing more than coincidence amplified by superstition. Others claim it was political entropy, the natural collapse of a dynasty unable to adapt to modernity. A few suggest it was psychological. A family dragging its own myth into self-fulfilling doom. But as you look at the portraits, at the documents, at the remnants of centuries, you realize something. The curse was never a force of magic. It was a force of humanity. Ambition without restraint. Power without humility. Tradition without evolution. Privilege without perspective. Fear without reflection. It was a curse written in choices, not in stars. You stop before one final display, a small plaque etched with the Bourbon motto. Nec pluribus impar. Not unequal to many. Once a proclamation of power. Now a quiet irony. As you linger, the archive around you seems to hum, as though all the centuries you've traveled through are vibrating beneath your feet. You feel the enormity of it, not just the dynasty's downfall, but the way their story shaped France, Europe, the very idea of monarchy. Their light was immense, their shadow even more so. And then you feel something softer, almost tender. Because beyond the chaos and tragedy, the Bourbons were simply people. Flawed, pressured, fragile, brilliant in moments, disastrous in others. They stumbled because humans stumble. They fell because every dynasty falls eventually. They became a lesson because that's what history does with its tragedies. It turns them into warnings for whoever comes next. You exhale slowly as the archive begins to dim. The papers settling, the light fading. You sense the journey winding down. The narrative relaxing its grip. The storm has passed. The crown has fallen. The curse, whether metaphor or myth, has run its course. And now, in these last quiet moments, the world asks you gently to let the images soften, to let the edges blur, to allow the dynasty's ending to become distant enough for rest. Your steps slow. Your breath deepens. The shelves around you shimmer like they're dissolving into memory's fog. This is the space where all stories sleep eventually, in the quiet. In the dim, in the soft hum of time turning pages on its own. And as you settle into the stillness, let your thoughts drift, the narrative unspooling like silk, lighter and lighter, softer and softer, until the Bourbon echoes fade into a warm, distant hush. The archive dims. Your mind relaxes. History closes its eyes. End of script. Sweet dreams.